The conference room was dim, its only light coming from a sleek brass lamp that cast elongated shadows over the polished wood table. The walls were lined with soundproof panels, ensuring that nothing spoken here would ever escape. It was a room meant for discretion, for conversations that were not meant to be overheard. A place where deals were struck, alliances forged, or, in some cases, broken. Donald Trump entered with his usual air of self-importance. His gait was slow but deliberate, his broad shoulders squared as he moved toward the center of the room. He had been in spaces like this before, powerful rooms filled with powerful people, all looking to get something from him. Yet, this time, it was different. This meeting was off the books, with no advisors, no cameras, and no chance for spin. He didn't need to prepare, he already knew what this was about. Another lecture, another attempt to paint him as the villain in someone else's narrative. Kamala Harris was already seated when he arrived. She had been waiting, her back straight, hands folded in front of her. Her expression betrayed nothing, though her eyes tracked his every movement. She didn't stand to greet him, nor did she offer the customary formalities that typically accompanied high-level meetings. Her silence alone was enough to signal her position. This wasn't a negotiation. Trump slowed, assessing the room, as if expecting to see someone else. No aides, no staff. Just her. His brows flickered upward for the briefest of moments, then smoothed over. He had sat across from world leaders, billionaires, and generals. Kamala Harris wasn't someone he feared. He took a seat across from her, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. The leather chair creaked slightly under his weight as he leaned back, adopting a posture of ease. He had mastered the art of appearing unbothered. He knew she was here to lecture him about Ukraine, about alliances, about the responsibilities of American leadership. He had heard it all before. Harris remained still, her features set in stone. The air between them thickened, the kind of silence that didn't come from a lack of words, but from the weight of what was about to be said. The room, despite its expensive decor, felt cold. Trump glanced at his watch, then back at her. If she was waiting for him to speak first, she would be waiting a long time. The clock on the wall ticked, each second stretching longer than the last. And then, without shifting, without breaking her gaze, Harris began. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. Kamala Harris wasted no time. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still clasped together, her voice steady but unwavering. The topic was Ukraine. There would be no pleasantries, no detours, no room for interpretation. She began with his words, his past remarks on the war, the dismissive tones, the casual indifference. She laid them out with precision, stripping away any ambiguity, letting them sit between them like evidence in a trial. His stance, she argued, was not just misguided but dangerous. Leadership, true leadership, demanded more than vague sentiments and shifting positions. It required conviction, a clear understanding of what was at stake, not just for Ukraine, but for America's place in the world. Her voice did not rise, nor did it waver. She spoke as though she were reciting history itself, a reminder of the choices America had once made, the alliances it had built, and the consequences that had followed when those alliances were tested. The United States had never been a nation to retreat in the face of aggression, she reminded him. It had always understood that democracy did not exist in isolation, it required defense, commitment, and above all, clarity. She invoked past conflicts, moments in history when the world had looked to America for leadership, and America had answered. The Cold War, the defense of Europe, the countless battles, some fought with weapons, others with diplomacy, that had ensured freedom endured. Turning a blind eye, she warned, did not bring peace. It invited something far worse. The lessons of history had proven that over and over again. Trump remained still, his expression unreadable. She pressed on. The war in Ukraine was not distant, not some abstract geopolitical conflict that could be dismissed in soundbites. It was real. It was brutal. And it was a test, one that America could not afford to fail. The moment the country hesitated, the moment it sent a message of doubt, was the moment adversaries took notice. And they were watching. Moscow. Beijing. Every nation that sought to weaken the very values America claimed to defend. They did not wait for official statements, they read between the lines. She let that thought settle before continuing. His words, his posture, his hesitations, intentional or not, were sending signals. Not just to America's enemies, but to its allies. To the countries that had stood with the United States, believing that democracy was worth fighting for. They had trusted America to lead. But what happened when that trust eroded? When America's word became unreliable? Trump still said nothing. There was no smirk, no dismissive shrug, no attempt to change the subject. He simply listened. It was unusual, almost unsettling. The man known for his interruptions, for his counterpunches, for his ability to twist any conversation to his advantage, sat in silence. Harris did not stop. If he would not speak, then she would continue until there was nothing left to say. She called his approach weak. Not because he lacked strength, but because true strength was measured in action. And the actions he had taken, the words he had chosen, had painted a picture of a leader unwilling to stand firm. That, she said, was dangerous. For all his bravado, for all the image he projected, he had given America's enemies something far more valuable than they could have hoped for: doubt. Doubt in leadership. Doubt in commitments. Doubt in the very idea that America would do what it had always done when faced with tyranny. The silence between them deepened. The air in the room felt heavier. For the first time, it seemed, Trump had nothing to say. The room, already heavy with tension, seemed to shrink around them. The air was thick, the silence suffocating, but Kamala Harris did not waver. She had seen men like Donald Trump before, figures who thrived on bluster, on spectacle, on the belief that dominance alone was a substitute for true leadership. But in this moment, stripped of an audience, devoid of the shield of applause and adoration, he had nothing to hide behind. And she had no intention of letting him escape the weight of his own choices. She leaned in, not physically, but with the sheer force of her words. Her critique sharpened, her voice controlled but unrelenting. She spoke of duty, of the burden that came with standing at the helm of the most powerful nation in the world. Leadership was not about slogans or crowd-pleasing bravado, it was about understanding the profound cost of every decision, of every word uttered in a position of influence. He had treated that responsibility carelessly, like a poker chip to be gambled with. And in doing so, he had betrayed something far greater than himself. America was not built on empty rhetoric. It had been forged in sacrifice, in the blood and sweat of those who had fought to preserve what it stood for. The soldiers who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, the men and women who had served in the bitter winters of Korea, the young recruits who had taken up arms in the deserts of the Middle East, they had all fought for something greater than themselves. They had fought because they believed in the promise of democracy, in the idea that America did not retreat from its responsibilities to the world. And yet, his actions, his words, had diminished those sacrifices. She let the weight of that accusation linger, watching for any flicker of response. But still, he said nothing. So she went further. This was not just a failure of policy, nor was it merely another political miscalculation. This was a fundamental betrayal of American values. To suggest that the suffering of a nation under siege was not America's concern, to treat the cries of the oppressed as background noise, to reduce matters of war and peace to mere transactional deals, it was a violation of everything the United States had once stood for. And the world had noticed. She locked eyes with him then, her gaze unflinching. A disgrace. That was what he had become to the country he claimed to love. The words, once spoken, seemed to echo in the stillness. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. A tightening of the jaw. A flicker of something unspoken. But still, he did not respond. The silence stretched on, heavy, immovable. For a long moment, there was nothing. No outburst, no defense, no attempt at a counterstrike. The room, already cold, seemed to still further, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Donald Trump, a man whose career had been built on bluster and defiance, remained motionless, his silence louder than any rebuttal he could have offered. He shifted in his chair, a slow, deliberate movement, but his gaze did not meet hers. His expression was unreadable, an unfamiliar stillness settling over his features. It could have been anger, simmering beneath the surface, restrained but waiting to be unleashed. Or perhaps it was something else, reflection, even if only for a fleeting second. Kamala Harris did not flinch. If he had expected his silence to unsettle her, to break the momentum of her words, he was mistaken. She knew silence. She had seen it used as a weapon before, a tool of avoidance, a shield for those unwilling to face what had been laid before them. But there was another kind of silence, the kind that came when words failed, when the weight of truth was too great to push aside. And that was the silence she recognized in him now. She leaned in, her presence unwavering, her voice steady. This was not just about him, not just about the man sitting across from her. It was about what would remain long after he was gone. History had a way of remembering those who abandoned their allies. It did not treat cowards kindly. She spoke of those who had once been given the same choice he now faced, leaders who had stood at similar crossroads, men who had been tested by the tides of war and tyranny. Some had risen, their legacies cemented in the unshakable foundation of democracy. Others had faltered, their names forever tied to the shame of inaction. There was no middle ground. History did not remember hesitation kindly. The weight of her words filled the space between them, pressing down, unmoving. Trump exhaled, a slow, almost imperceptible breath. His fingers curled against the smooth surface of the table, his grip tightening for just a fraction of a second before releasing. He did not argue. He did not lash out. He said nothing. The silence stretched. The silence lingered, thick and unyielding, stretching between them like an impassable chasm. The weight of it was suffocating, yet Kamala Harris did not move, nor did she allow the stillness to weaken her resolve. She had said what needed to be said. There was nothing left to add, no need to punctuate her words with further explanation. Across the table, Donald Trump sat unmoving, his face a mask of neutrality. If there was anger, he concealed it. If there was regret, he buried it deep. But something in his posture betrayed the tension coiled within him, the slightest rigidity in his shoulders, the faint tightening of his jaw. For all his bravado, for all the years spent wielding words like weapons, he had none now. Then, without ceremony, without so much as a final glance in her direction, he stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the otherwise silent room. His movements were slow, methodical, but not hesitant. He straightened his jacket with a practiced tug, his fingers brushing the fabric as though resetting himself. Whatever he was thinking remained locked behind that carefully crafted facade. He turned, walked toward the door, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, the finality of it echoing through the room. Kamala Harris remained seated, her hands resting lightly against the polished table, her expression unreadable. She did not smile, did not allow herself the satisfaction of a visible victory. And yet, deep within her, a moment of quiet triumph flickered. Not the kind captured by cameras, not the kind that would be analyzed by pundits or debated by political strategists. This was something else. For once, Donald Trump had been left with nothing to say. She took a slow breath, exhaling as she gathered her things. The meeting had been private. There would be no recordings, no transcripts, no instant headlines dissecting every word spoken between them. And yet, she knew, this moment would be remembered. Not by the world. Not by the crowds that had chanted his name or the opponents who had spent years trying to dismantle him. It would be remembered by him. The truth had been laid before him, unvarnished and immovable. Whether he acknowledged it aloud or buried it beneath layers of denial, it would remain with him. A weight he could not ignore. A shadow that would follow him long after this night. As she rose from her seat, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency, she allowed herself one last glance at the empty chair he had left behind. Then, without another thought, she turned and walked away.